Good evening, welcome. I'm David Scobie, Dean of the New School for Public Engagement, a division here at the New School, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's conversation about Chris Hayes' wonderful book, Twilight of the Elites, America After Meritocracy, conducted by Chris and Katrina vanden Heuvel, editor and publisher of The Nation magazine. The Nation and the New School have been partners over many years in presenting vibrant public programs on public issues and public culture to the New York public and the global public. We're actually broadcasting this thanks to Free Speech TV and live streaming it on their website. But as I was saying, the Nation and the New School have long been partners in these programs, and Chris and Katrina were in this hall 9 months ago for an extraordinary panel discussion on the 10th anniversary of 9/11. It's a joy to welcome them back and to celebrate the publication of this book. As a cultural historian, I'm mindful how hard it is to write a history of the present moment, to tell a story that makes sense of our current experience in real time, that steps back just enough to show us patterns and connections, but not too far back to lose the felt pulse of what we're living through. Twilight of the Elites does just that, connecting the Tea Party and the Ninth Ward of New Orleans and Enron and Iraq in a portrait of what Chris Hayes trenchantly calls the fail decade, a legitimation crisis that has spanned all sectors and spawned widespread mistrust across all ideologies. This is a book that manages the feat of taking seriously both feelings and institutions in that crisis. And it's often difficult to take those to see those taken seriously in public commentary. It frames an argument, in fact, it frames a polemical argument, but it does so with a large-minded attention to personal storytelling. It's a book that makes you think afresh about everything from Barack Obama's biography to cognitive science and social theory. It's a terrific book, as tonight's discussion will illuminate. You're going to hear about it through a conversation between Katrina vanden Heuvel and Chris Hayes. Katrina, as I noted, is editor and publisher of The Nation, as well as the author and editor of many books herself, including The Change I Believe In, and Taking Back America, and Taking Down the Radical Right. Along with her duties at The Nation, she's a columnist for WashingtonPost.com, a blogger at TheNation.com, and a frequent commentator on television and public radio. Chris Hayes is editor-at-large of The Nation and the host of Up with Chris Hayes on MSNBC, Saturday morning at 7, Sunday.
Saturday and Sunday at 8 now.
Sorry, my bad. I'm glad you're getting a little more sleep.
Yes, yeah.
A journalist and public commentator, he writes about politics, political economy, and political culture, not only in The Nation, but in many venues that I won't list here. As you will learn when you read his book, he grew up in the Bronx, and as you will know if you watch MSNBC, he's the father of an adorable baby. And most importantly for tonight, he's the author of Twilight of the Elites. Chris and Katrina will discuss the book for perhaps 45 minutes, and then we're eager for your questions and comments. You'll notice, I hope, that you've received index cards as you came in, or if not, our friends from The Nation up and down the aisles can get them to you. Please be thinking of your questions and responses and hand them into the staff in the aisles for a Q&A that I'll help moderate at the end. And I want to note that after the conversation, Chris will be available for a book signing out on in the public foyer of Tishman Auditorium. And finally, before we start, let me quickly thank a few folks for helping to make this conversation possible. First of all, to Chris Hayes and Katrina vanden Heuvel, and to their colleague at The Nation, Peter Rothberg, who is always our partner in crime for organizing these public programs. And let's give it up also for my colleagues, Francisco Tizen and Pam Tillis of the New School. And finally, as I said before, our gratitude to Free Speech TV for broadcasting and live streaming this conversation.
David, thank you. And thank you, New School, for hosting this conversation. I don't think you touched the New School in your book.
No, they make it out okay.
David listed some of my work and accomplishments, but I sit here tonight in front of you proud that I hired Chris Hayes. When some thought it was a risk, a gamble, to bring on a 28-year-old to head the DC Bureau of the Nation. I thought it was a great step, and I think I'm confirmed in that. But I just want to say just 2 words before we start the conversation. The book is remarkable in the ways Chris is remarkable. Chris is an intellectual omnivore. He is a remarkable writer and political writer and reporter and thinker. And he's also someone of integrity and judgment. And he brings those qualities, he will in the future, he brings those qualities to his writing in The Nation. But in these days, I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, have seen him from 8 to 10, Saturdays and Sundays, because he brings those qualities to a medium which has been starved of those very traits. There are no sort of 3-minute hackathon pundits on Chris's show. And I don't think you can find anything else like it, except, of course, Melissa Harris Perry's show, which follows Chris
Just
from
keep the
10 to
television
12.
on, folks.
10 to 12.
Even if you leave the room.
If you want to watch a roundtable, a smart roundtable on financial regulation, atheism, or Israel-Palestine issues, or food, as we were talking about. Tonight, it's a discussion about Chris's new book, which is a remarkable combination of social theory, of analysis, and writing. And we at The Nation saw some of that, because some of those pieces were in the book. But want to begin with, you make a provocative suggestion for what we should name the first decade of the 21st century, the fail decade. How did we get here, and what are some of the examples that define and set this decade apart? And if I could ask, this idea of a crisis of authority, why is it new? Haven't we seen it in different ways over the last, say, 200 years?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, and I think one of the initial projects of the book is when you're writing a work of social criticism, I think the first impulse when you're saying, oh, we don't trust our institutions, or there's been a lot of failure this decade, is the impulse to be like, well, isn't there always failure? Do we ever really trust our institutions? And so one of the things I really want to do in the first chapter of the book is to establish for people, if you do take a step back and you survey the wreckage of the failed decade, I think it really does stand out in terms of just the sheer scope, scale, and viciousness of the amount of institutional failure. This is a decade that began with Bush v. Gore. It very quickly, we had the worst mass murder in the history of the country take place on our soil. That was pulled off by people that managed to get through the largest security apparatus in the history of human civilization. We then went to war in Iraq at the cost of more than 4,000 American lives, 100,000 Iraqi lives, $800 billion burned like oil fire in the desert. From there, we went to watching an American city drown on live national television while all of us watched helpless. And a quick step from there to the largest housing bubble in the history of the planet at a worth of $800 trillion, which then imploded and caused the greatest financial crisis in 70 years. And I am leaving out the near collapse of the big 3 automakers, the fact that newspapers around the country imploded in on themselves, the sex abuse scandal in the Catholic Church, Enron, which at the time was the largest corporate bankruptcy, which now seems quaint in the wake of the financial crisis, and the longest period of war in the Republic's history. So I think you could really make the case it was an especially crappy decade. And I think so the crisis of authority that I talk about in the book is the way that is the consequence of that institutional failure, the emanations of that. And the starting point for the book was a combination of my own sensation of feeling that I didn't know who or what I could trust. And this would guide me even as a reporter. Like, you end up as a reporter often adjudicating disputes that you don't necessarily quite feel qualified to adjudicate. And in some strange way, that's the experience of citizenship during these times. There's no bedrock of institutional authority to attach yourself to, and there's a series of disputing claims that you yourself can adjudicate. It's like a sailor out at sea without a lighthouse, or a sailor out at sea with multiple lighthouses, some of which you know are fake, put there to trick you. And in terms of this crisis of authority, what marks it off, like we have some data, and in fact, the germ for the book was coming upon that data. The General Social Survey, which is a longitudinal study of American public opinion, combined with polling done by Gallup and Pew, shows that they begin in the 1970s in the wake of Watergate, the iconic crisis of authority. There's a James Reston quote in the book here from slightly before Watergate that sort of captures it. They begin polling because they're concerned about this crisis of authority in the country and people's trust for their pillar institutions. And if you look at the data, what you find out is what they thought was the nadir of public trust in institutions was in fact the high watermark. And in fact, we are living through the nadir right now. Right now is essentially the nadir of public trust in institutions. And some of the most bedrock central institutions in the country. I mean, Congress famously is the least trusted institution. Its approval ratings rank below Paris Hilton and the US going communist.
Yeah. That's my favorite.
The most trusted institution in the country, the only institution that gained trust in the course of the decade is the United States military. And I think our founders who placed Congress in Article 1 as the foundational institution of the new republic and were skeptical about the need or wisdom of having a standing army would be quite disconcerted to find the republic in that state.
Shape. I thought of one of the factors you offer for the crisis of authority in watching Jamie Dimon testify the other day. And you have a very moving quote from Desmond Tutu in the book, an observation that apartheid dehumanized whites as well as blacks in South Africa. And you argue that extreme inequality has produced pathologies in our elites, and one of these pathologies is this cult of smartness. And again, I thought of that cult in watching a man who has been proud to be the smartest banker on the street. So tell us some of the examples of how this cult has played out in the last decade, and what role does accountability come in checking this cult?
I'm really glad you mentioned the Desmond Tutu quote, which is from his memoir, which is a really quite excellent book. And yeah, he says apartheid was horrible for the people on the top of the social order. Obviously, if you had to choose and flip a coin which one you wanted to be on, that's very clear. Much worse to be on the bottom. But it was dehumanizing for the people that oversaw the system. And actually, I think that quote is the moral core of the entire book in some ways. Because we talk a lot about the ways that inequality, the people in this room, the people that read The Nation, the people on the left broadly, talk a lot about the ways that inequality is bad for people on the bottom of the social pyramid. It's led to stagnating wages, it's led to alienation and dislocation and removal from political power. But I basically don't make any of those arguments in the book. The chief argument I make is that one of the most pernicious and catastrophic consequences of extreme inequality of the kind we have is that it makes people at the top worse. The more elitist American society gets, the worse the caliber of elites it produces. And the current system produces these pathologies. And I should state this here, in case it's not clear. I am a product of a lot of these institutions as well. And it drives me a little nuts when I see people rail against the elite with no self-awareness. I once was at the Heritage Foundation and saw Dick Armey just going after the elite. And it's bro, who are we kidding? You were in the Republican leadership in Congress. You work for one of the influence peddling firms in Washington. Have a little self-awareness. And I say this just to say that I'm a cable news host, and I got a really amazing education, and I've been gifted with a lot of privilege.
But in the book, I love the section where you talk about Sonia Sotomayor, because as she was raised as a possible nominee, you had people like Lawrence Tribe and Jeffrey Rosen debating whether she was smart enough.
Yeah, that was such a revealing episode, and that gets to this cult of smartness. One of the pathologies that our current system of inequality and the meritocracy that helps produce it creates is this pathological cult of smartness, which is not just valuing smartness, because I think, I like smart people. I like when people call me smart. I like when people call my show smart. It's actually thinking that smartness is the singular trait that matters above all else, right? And it's necessary for functioning elites or decision makers, but it's certainly not sufficient. I mean, prudence, empathy, compassion, judgment, all of those are equally important, I think. So we see that with Jamie Dimon, right, who's a classic smartest guy in the room. In fact, we see it in the deference that the sitting senator showed to Jamie Dimon. That's a perfect example of exactly that kind of status anxiety dynamic that is produced by the cult of smartness, which is you have to kind of defer to the smartest person in the room. And that creates the conditions to unleash what I call in the book destructive intelligence. Mm-hmm. David Addington is a perfect example of this, okay? David Addington, who was the general counsel for Vice President Dick Cheney and then later became his chief of staff after Scooter Libby had other engagements. David Addington is someone who, by every conceivable metric, anyone that's ever met him says the guy is just brilliant, just complete, total cognitive horsepower. Incredibly good at honing arguments on the fly. He's voracious at synthesizing information. And under those conditions, he was able to win arguments in a room that pushed us towards profoundly destructive and immoral activities. Yeah. And so that's one of the costs of the cult of smartness is this thinking that smartness is an ordinal quality, like height. Like, Danny DeVito is shorter than Michael Jordan, but Michael Jordan is shorter than Yao Ming, right? So-and-so is smarter than so-and-so, and so-and-so is smarter than so. And in fact, Lawrence Tribe, who is a man that I have just tremendous admiration, respect for, in this leaked memo that came out when he was writing to the president about possible nominees, engages in exactly this activity. And he says, Sonia Sotomayor is not as smart as Elena Kagan, but Diane Wood is smarter than Sotomayor, but not as smart as Elena Kagan. She's between the two. But this is very commonplace. I mean, you hear this a lot. I heard it in Washington. You hear it around law schools.
But let's go back to what you were saying about Dick Armey, because I don't want to. But
I should say when he said this because this is the perfect touch. When he was at the Heritage Foundation railing against the elites, he was wearing cowboy boots and a cowboy hat.
That's the cultural affect, right?
Exactly.
But you, in a chapter called Winners, you argue that next to freedom, there's probably no more contested word in the American political vocabulary than elite, right? So you have a Sarah Palin railing against the elites. You have Dick Armey railing against the elites in cowboy boots. But what I valued about your work is that you, and I don't mean to inflate your head, but in a tradition of, Pareto, Michelle, C. Wright Mills, you're trying to restore the true meaning of the word elite. So tell us what it is, but how do we get it into our...
How do we wrench it back?
Yeah.
So, I think that's a great point. I mean, the fact is the word elites is much more invoked by the right than the left, generally.
And there's an anti-intellectualism.
And they have redefined elite to be a number of things, mostly embodied by an attitude. So when Brian Williams said to Sarah Palin in 2008, you use this, you castigate the elites a lot. Like, what do you mean by that? She said, anyone that looks down on someone else, right? And then, of course, there's the very familiar host of cultural signifiers that we all know of, right? Prius driving, wine drinking, brie eating,
Volvo drink. Yeah,
right, Volvo, lattes, all this like caricatured thing. Jeffrey Numberg, who's a linguist who's on Fresh Air sometimes, said that the definition of elite on the right is those who have seditious taste in cheese and beverages, which I think is a pretty good line. And of course, that's preposterous, right? I mean, that is, and it's also ahistorical. Right. I mean, writers on both the left and the right writing about the elites, and there's a literature on this, and particularly a really interesting literature that I went back to in working on the book of some of the names you cite around the turn of the 19th century, when Europe is experimenting with democracy and finding that putatively democratic societies can be quite oligarchic in actuality. Writers on the right and left understand that the elites are people that have a disproportionate influence over a society's direction. Mm-hmm. A relatively small group of people that have access, large accesses of social capital, resources, networks, money, political power.
Right.
And I think it's really worthwhile reclaiming that. And I actually think one of the most useful things about the Occupy Wall Street rough division of 1%, 99%, is that even if it's a blunt way of describing the phenomenon, it's more or less right. Mm-hmm. It's a rough approximation of a good definition. I mean, you could quibble a little bit around the edges of what that means, but it captures something core and important about what we should be thinking about when we think about the elite.
You write, you quote someone talking about how one of the defining features of our time is, of modern public life, is post-truth politics. So what's the complicity of sort of corporate, quote, mainstream media in devising this politics?
Would you like me to rail against corporate media?
Yeah. You don't have to answer this. You can take all amendments still available in this country. But
Saturdays and Sundays at 8 a.m.
But what's the complicity of the media in propping up and maintaining the meritocracy, in not going to unconventional outsider voices, which you do quite frequently?
So I think the post-truth politics is a phrase that a Democratic political operative used. And he was using it, I thought it was just a brilliant analysis. He was using it in the midst of the healthcare fight. Mm-hmm. And he said, the thing that's driving me crazy about this fight is that the White House seems to think that they can win political victories with substantive concessions. Which is to say, we're going to bargain over this, and okay, you don't want us to have the public option, so we'll jettison the public option. He's like, but we're in post-truth politics. It doesn't matter if the public option is in or out of the bill in terms of what people's opinion is of it. They're going to be told it's a government takeover of healthcare either way. Why are you making these substantive concessions? I understand making substantive concessions if, in fact, it brings you political benefit. That's the way politics works.
Yeah.
But if you're making a substantive concession that doesn't actually bring a political benefit, because the people who are hearing about the substance of the bill are going to be told the exact same thing, whether you had actual death panels or didn't have death panels, you are operating in what he called post-truth politics. And I think post-truth politics gets at a core, if I could use this word, epistemic crisis in the country.
Oh, big word.
We are, one of the effects of the crisis of authority, the fact that we don't have central repositories of trust, is that it has destroyed the very mental habits by which we can form beliefs. I mean, how do you know what's going on in public life? Well, you read The Nation, you turn on NPR, like a good caricature of a liberal. Maybe you watch cable news, you talk to friends, you read government pronouncements, you read blogs. But the fact of the matter is, those are all trust relationships. Like, you don't actually know anything that's going on. You're getting it from someone else. The word media comes from mediating between something that's out here and the person who's getting the information. So everything we know in the world is based on trust, right? How do you know there are 50 states in the Union? Like, you haven't driven around, right? Like, a bunch of people told you that, right? And you use this rough metric of consensus to say, yeah, that's true. But if a bunch of people tell you housing prices are going to go up forever, and then they don't, and then you're $50,000 underwater, well then, how do you go about navigating the next time that everyone says X? For instance, when everyone says the planet is warming.
Well,
right? I don't know. I haven't done the regressions. Like, I've read some of the science. I just trust that the scientists are right.
this raises, to me, one of the most interesting parts of the book. You're wrestling with two agents of change, in a sense, or you say, let's go beyond the left-right mantra. And it's not a glib way of putting it, but you describe that there's the institutionalist and the insurrectionist. And the institutionalist is one who remains faithful to the status quo, like a modern-day Edmund Burke or a David Brooks, who is always channeling his inner institutionalism, but who doesn't want to see erosion of authority and wants to maintain institutional trust, even in a post-truth, post-trust environment. And then there are the insurrectionists, who see this chaos, this moment, as an opportunity to rethink. But you're wrestling with that because you are saying, as you just did, that you do need in a society repositories of trust for some judgment. But tell us, I'm interested in how the insurrectionist, institutionalist plays out in your life, your work, your verdant mind.
So I think that it's a useful way of thinking about the present crisis, insurrectionists and institutionalists, because I think there are insurrectionists on the left and the right, and I think there's institutionalists on the left and the right. And I think the institutionalists, I think David Brooks is the most eloquent and persuasive, actually, voice for institutionalism. And in fact, he wrote a column this week that was just purely channeling a very direct institutional case in which he makes the argument in the column. He says the failure is not failure of our elites. The failure is of the populace to appreciate how hard the elites work.
It's true.
Basically.
And that they must follow the elites.
And I clearly don't agree with that. But it captures something about the institutionalist mindset, which is that the chief problem isn't institutional failure or elite failure, it is distrust. And if you talk to senators, both parties, this is the line they give you. I talked to Bob Bennett in the book. In fact, let me let's just, since I have the book in front of me, I'll read you the quote from Mr. Bennett. All right. Could never do this on live television, but you'll bear with me. So Bob Bennett, long-serving member of the United States Senate, helped engineer TARP, was on a bipartisan working group to come up with healthcare legislation. It wasn't the Affordable Care Act. It was another bill, Wyden-Bennett. And he says, look, and Bob Bennett's career, I should say, was prematurely cut short when the Tea Party organized an insurrection against him at the Utah State Party Convention and dumped him for a very young, very, very right-wing candidate. He says, the moral for that story is if people will read responsible publications and commentators, and they have a sense of respect for institutions and those of us who labor in those institutions, then we're okay. But if you get all your information from the blogs, then you're just angry because we're lying to you. And I think the institutionalist views the distrust we have as being produced by a pernicious media environment that seizes on every failure. And it's not a completely preposterous notion. I mean, one can imagine a media in which none of us ever got to see Anthony Weiner's crotch.
I can't.
And it's hard. Yes, you can't. I guess you can't erase that image from your mind. But it's hard to think the Republic is any better for us having had the privilege, right? I mean, so there is some aspect in which there's something compelling about what institutionalists are saying. But I put myself in the insurrectionist camp because I think the chief problem isn't the distrust. The chief problem is the terrible institutional performance. The chief problem is that the elites have really screwed things up and keep screwing things up. And that's what needs to be fixed. And if we fix that, if we have a society with institutions that are working, then the trust will flow from that. And I worry about that distrust as well. I mean, I have an inner David Brooks. Yeah. Because when I look at climate change, I think to myself, we cannot solve this problem in the current landscape of the crisis of authority. Because the scale and scope of change that is necessary requires a level of social consensus that is impossible to achieve if there are no socially trusted institutions. A book that was very influential in my thinking on this is a Pulitzer Prize-winning book called The Race Beat. It's a great book. And it's a history of, essentially, the white northern press covering the civil rights movement. And one of the things that's so fascinating about that book and that story is that it shows you, A, how much civil rights protesters in the South were so cognizant of how important media coverage was. And B, how important the kind of establishment weight and power of the northern white press was to turning the tide on northern white opinion of Jim Crow. And one wonders if you rerun the counterfactual, if you took our current environment and tried to have the civil rights struggle with things as balkanized as they are, whether that massive sea change in opinion that happened among northern white folks changed a little when the movement came to the north.
Yeah, the movement, yeah.
Whether that would have been possible. And that's really my fear.
You talked about fixes. I mean, the power of the book, it seems, the power of the book is in its diagnosis of the problems, and then you begin to offer some solutions.
This is what's known as the last chapter problem.
You call it reformation,
Yeah.
which is a great, but, so let me ask you, I mean, you have some strong proposed solutions. Make America more equal. And you offer, it's all good stuff. You have good ideas. You also argue that we need to build a trans-ideological coalition. And I think that's critical, tough. And then you come to this idea that the real agent of reform will be the newly radicalized upper middle class. Why? Someone like a Francis Fox Piven who writes for The Nation would argue it would be a radicalized, poor, working class movement. And just last thing is, it's reminded me a little bit of the progressive movement of a different time, where you had an upper middle class eager to restrain corporations, good government. So I'm just interested in why you think that is the agent.
There's a few reasons, I think. I think that the institutional failures that have happened in the last decade are simply bringing to the attention of the upper middle class institutional failures that have happened in poor and underserved communities for years. I mean, trust in institutions in poor neighborhoods is not very high because institutional performance in poor neighborhoods is not very high. People in public housing in Chicago, I talked to Mary Johns, who's a woman who edits the Resident Journal in Chicago, talking about calling in a complaint that there were ankle deep in water in Cabrini Green, and in the middle of winter, and the problem not being fixed for 2 days, right? Under those conditions, you don't trust institutions because they fail you.
Yeah.
And so I think that people who live in places where institutional failure has been the rule for a long time see the current crisis of authority much less as a disruption. I think the people who feel it as a disruption are folks that have a relative amount of privilege and power, who now find themselves facing institutional failure and feel radicalized by it. And I think if you look, and this isn't totally some fantastical thought. If you actually look at there's a Pew study that looked at the Howard Dean activists in 2004. These were upper middle class folks. Like the people that were going out and knocking on doors and were active in that campaign were upper middle class people. They were people with 4-year college degrees and graduate degrees. They had median incomes that were quite a bit higher than the nation's median income. If you look at Tea Party activists, they fit a very similar demographic profile. And I think it's because the core feeling of the failed decade, is a sense of betrayal, a sense that the game is rigged, which is a sentence the president invokes sometimes, the vice president invokes, it's invoked by the Tea Party, I've heard it invoked by Occupy Wall Street, I've heard it in my reporting a lot. The game is rigged. The idea that there are people at the top, and obviously the people at the top change depending on the political valence, right? The people at the top can be the people that run the Federal Reserve or the public union bosses, right? Or they can be Jamie Dimon.
Right.
Well, I guess the Federal Reserve is actually in a point of agreement between the left and the right. That the people at the top have rigged the game in their favor. And I think that feeling, the other reason that I think there's this upper middle class radicalization is actually something that we're seeing, is that the growth in inequality is most visible to the people that are right next to it. Like, the growth of inequality doesn't, if you're driving a gypsy cab in the Bronx, like, it's unclear that the massive money that hedge fund people are making is in your social view. Whereas if you went to a good law school and you're at a firm and you're doing pretty well, but your friend who you didn't think was actually that bright, who didn't make law review and you did, and then he went to a hedge fund and he's making $5 million a year, you're like, what's up with that? And that I think is, there's a site of disruption and resentment and frustration there. The huge problem, let me just say the obvious thing, is that I don't write that much in the book about polarization as a phenomenon. And partly that's just because other people have written a lot on polarization, but it's a fact. I mean, all the data we're getting, increasingly, about people, not just politicians, people, is that we are in the midst of a huge polarization, and it's asymmetric. The right is moving to the right much faster than the left is moving to the left. But polarization is a fact, and it's real in this country, and I don't know. Maybe it'll be my next book is going after it.
That's your next.
No, I mean, because I actually...
But a trans-ideological coalition becomes more
An
difficult in
obstacle
times
to that,
of...
and I've had a real conversion on this. I mean, I think because I came of age politically as a reporter and as someone grappling with public life in the age of post 9/11 bipartisanship that produced the Iraq War.
The financial crisis.
Yeah, like I think, and also produced deregulation of credit default swaps. Like, I'm not a huge fan of bipartisanship, and I reacted very strongly against the fetishization of bipartisanship that characterized a lot of Beltway culture. So I was just like, screw bipartisanship, we need to kick their butts,
Right.
the other side. You're applauding before I get to the butt. So that's the first, that's before I had my conversion. So you can boo at the end of this sentence. But I do think, I have come to believe not that we should have compromise for compromise's sake or bipartisanship for bipartisanship's sake. I still don't believe that. I don't think we should cut a grand bargain with John Boehner because he's been reckless and extreme and intransigent. I do think, though, that polarization really is a problem. I do think that it's hard to conceive of getting the kind of change we need at the scale we need it under the current conditions of polarization.
So
Thank you.
let me ask you one more question, because we'll open it up. But we took questions from readers via Facebook and email and comments on your fine excerpt in The Nation in this
Yeah,
last
shout out to
issue.
Richard Kim, who edited that and did a
Yay,
really
shout out to
amazing
Richard
job.
Kim. But there was a real hunger to hear what your cure is.
I know.
You know, there's a hunger, sort of the darkness before the dawn moment. And so one reader sent a really long question, but it had to do with the ideas of Murray Bookchin and social ecologists, and how do we organize our society, and how do we maybe think of a municipal libertarianism at scale?
Mm-hmm.
And I know you have problems with small scale. How do we do collective
Right.
democratic governance? But I'm wondering, you talk at the end of the book about innovations, new platforms. How do you reinvent the organization of society, politics, and economy? Small question.
In 30 seconds. Someone who read the book on Twitter, who I read, who's...
You read, wait, 140 characters?
No, I mean, someone who read the book and I were interacting on Twitter. There is no Twitter edition. We have not reached that dark dystopic day yet. It will come. Someone who read the book said to me on Twitter, I thought the book was, kind of a radical critique with disappointingly conventionally liberal solutions. And a center-right writer that I have tremendous admiration and respect for, a guy by the name of Connor Friedersdorf, who, if you're not reading, you really should be reading. He's just an incredible writer, incredibly thoughtful, writes for The Atlantic, and he had a review of the book today that was similarly critical of this, how do you solve it? And I want to say a few things. One is that at the end of the day, I am kind of a conventional Rawlsian liberal. And I think that conventional Rawlsian liberalism is pretty radical where our current political system is. I mean, we are so far from living up to anything that looks like that kind of conventional redistributionist liberalism that as a political project, I mean, if we could have something that looked more like that, I would be really happy.
Yeah.
In terms of solutions, I mean, so the headline solution is we should make the society more equal. We should worry more about equality of outcomes than we do. It's not like rocket science. We right now, because we have this consensus view of meritocracy in which we neatly divide between equality of opportunity and equality of outcomes, The result of that is that we ask the education system to expiate the sins of the rest of the society.
So true.
We just say, the more and more inequality we get, the harder and harder we on our schools for failing to make up what is going on over here, right? And so, we should worry about equality of outcomes. And I cite the example of Brazil in the book, and this is true of a lot of Latin America. Brazil and Latin America have bucked the trend of the rest of the world where inequality keeps growing in that it's been shrinking. And it's not rocket science what happened. A bunch of center-left political parties ran explicitly on agendas of redistribution. They got elected and they redistributed. And then the countries got more equal. Lula initiated a program of larger transfer payments to very poor people. He raised the minimum wage. He raised pension payouts. He made the taxation system more progressive. This all sounds like the driest, boringest liberal catechism, but it actually does make a society more equal. If you're worried about inequality, and in some ways that I think should be an optimistic note, which is that creating a more equal society is what computer programmers would call a solved problem, right? Like, it's not that we don't know how to do it. There are, we could sit here among everyone in the room and just brainstorm different ways. Right. And some of those would be good, and some of them would be bad, and some of them would be more effective than others. And, I just found out that FDR actually thought there should be a maximum wage of $340,000 a year. That's even radical for me. Like, I don't believe in a maximum wage. So there are ways that you could reduce inequality. I think that would probably not be good. But overall, the problem is much more a political problem. And this is where I was really heartened by where Connor Friedersdorf ended this review. Because he said, I don't like these solutions. These are my solutions.
And then opened it up to...
And he said, I want to... And it was great. It was all sorts of stuff about I want to get rid of licensing obstacles because that's a way of people with, credentials to protect their turf and drive up the cost of what they do, to use cartels. It was a bunch of sort of libertarianish center-right solutions. And he said, I want readers to send me their solutions. Right. And the biggest political project of the book is initiating a debate about the social order that we have, which we don't discuss explicitly because it is the bedrock that underlies all the other discussions. The meritocracy is the name we give to the American dream. It's the system that we've put in place, it's the aspiration we have, and the set of interlocking institutions that we've created that we think will produce the thing that we want, which is the ability of people to rise from any station in life to the highest heights as far as their talent and ability and drive will take them. And the facts of the matter are that in the 30 or 40 years that we have had this social model, inequality has massively expanded and social mobility has declined. It is not delivering on the promise. It is not delivering on its foundational promise. Mm-hmm. The book is called America After Meritocracy because I want the book to initiate a discussion about what America looks like after meritocracy.
Before I ask David to come up on stage, I think when we spoke a few days ago, you suggested that science maybe was one of the institutions that had escaped the trap of meritocracy. So I'm hoping science will clone you, and I'm hoping that you will go into schools. I would love to see you go back to Hunter and speak about this book, because initiating those conversations in schools everywhere would be really valuable.
I definitely want to go to schools. I want to go to Hunter. Hunter, my high school, features pretty prominently in the book. And I want to say one more thing about education, if that's all right, because I think one of the things I read about in one of the chapters of the book when I read about the steroid scandal in baseball, I have a chapter that looks at the steroid scandal in baseball, the culture of Enron, and the culture of Wall Street.
And the church.
And I talk a little bit about the church, but in that chapter I'm talking about these three institutions which are very explicitly created along meritocratic lines, right? Big payouts for performance, you can get a $10 million contract. Harsh punishment for failure. At Enron, they would fire 10% of the workforce every 2 years that got the worst HR evaluations. And the point that you take away from that and looking carefully at the steroid scandal is that it turns out it's hard to design a system with massive reward for success and performance that isn't also a system with massive reward for cheating. Those two things are very close to each other. And in an intensely competitive meritocratic environment, Moral norms are essentially all that divide the two. And when those begin to dissolve, it takes over the institution. And the reason I think this is really important in terms of education is that we are right now in the midst of a national experiment of converting the model of teachers from bureaucracy to meritocracy. That is what we are doing. We are saying we no longer are going to value seniority. And believe me, there's a lot of criticisms of bureaucracy. It's not that the critiques of bureaucracy are necessarily wrong. It's that we don't have any critical look at what is on the other side of that. If we are going to shift the model from bureaucracy to meritocracy in our education system, which means big rewards for performance, harsh punishment for failure, we shouldn't be surprised when we start to see cheating scandals. And what have we started to see?
You report on it in the book. And
we started to see massive cheating scandals.
Yeah, Atlanta, massive. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks to both of you. That was really wonderful. Before I pose my first question or two, I want to correct myself. I think I said that there's book signing outside the hall, but it's going to be right here after the conversation.
Let's move some units, folks. It's a joke.
Trust me, buy some books. So many, many important issues to talk about, and we already have some important questions that were sent into the nation and some that are coming down the aisle. Let me start with a question that came via Facebook. Via email, and it actually is a particular institutional location that you didn't talk about in the conversation, but that's lurking everywhere, which is the major political parties. The question that Larry Rosenkranz asked is, what can be done to make our major political parties more responsive to the broader public? I mean, they exemplify post-truth politics, all of the pathologies that you talk about. Do you think of their institutional form as recoverable? How do you think of intervening in that space?
That's a good question. Well, here's what I think. I think that we are in the midst of tearing down the last shreds of an illusion that we can preserve the ideal and core egalitarian radical promise of democracy, that one person, one vote, we are all created equal. An ideal that is, we lose sight of how intensely radical it is. I mean, that means like all us, like the people that you ride the train with, the people that you go to work with who you can't stand. Like, you're deciding what to do, right? That I think that we're at a point where that promise, its compatibility with the kind of political economy we have, is we are tearing down the last shred of the illusion that we can have both in the Citizens United era. And I don't have particularly cogent or well-formed thoughts about what that does to the political parties, but I do think that there is, I believe very deeply that there's going to be a kind of democratic backlash to the politics of a Citizens United era. I do think that people have a visceral intuition that a universe in which a handful of billionaires can essentially choose candidates the way that horse owners do and run them down the track is just totally offensive and odious to our democratic commitments.
Does that inner Burkean in you, which I tend to share, the kind of left Burkean voice that's looking for some rebuilding of trust, the folks like Jeff Sachs have started to talk about the need for a third party, a new kind of politics. It's that same voice of finding new interconnections. Do you go there too?
I guess I just, for some reason, and this is a weird thing to say as someone who ostensibly covers politics for a living, the parties to me covering them seems so much to be symptoms rather than causes of the problem. You know, they're the name that is given to a certain coalition of interests. And the problems are the coalition of interests more than the parties themselves as institutional players. In fact, I think the parties in some ways are not particularly strong institutional players at this point. What is strong is the intense polarization sorting process that we are going through. You know, you said that they've become less responsive, and in some ways they aren't responsive, right? I mean, when you look at, there's all sorts of ways that you can match polling with what policy happens, and in fact, there's this amazing study that I cite in the book by Martin Gillens at Princeton, and there's also a study by Larry Bartels, and it looks at voting records of senators and preferences of their constituencies by their income level, and what it finds is that the opinions of people in the bottom third of the income scale do not matter at all. Literally don't matter at all. Can't predict the votes of senators at all. Now that makes sense at a certain level. Like, yeah, poor people don't have a huge influence in politics. But he also found that the people in the second third, their preferences literally don't matter at all. Like, don't predict at all the way the senators vote. The only thing that predicts the way the senators vote are the preferences and opinions of the people in the top third. So to me, the political parties are kind of, there's all sorts of things I don't like about them, but I don't see them specifically as big drivers of the problems that I see. I see them much more as symptoms of bigger problems that kind of constitute them in the ugly fashion they're constituted.
So here's another question from Facebook. Robert Salzberg asks, if you reject a meritocracy, what would you replace it with? And I take that to be not just a question about cures and proposals, but how do you think about making decisions about who does what and the way we organize labor and specialization if meritocracy is so tainted with this kind of commitment to inequality that you're worried about?
It's a good question, and it's one I've been asked a lot. I mean, I think that, I say in the book, you know, when you're talking in specific terms, institutionally, organizationally, you know, if you're running an organization, I mean, anyone who's ever worked in a workplace recognizes that people have different talents and sometimes have different levels of motivation, sometimes have different levels of competence. That's not like a total fiction. And any organization that completely ignored that, right, that just, you know, gave out numbers for people to do jobs would probably do very poorly. So I'm not advocating that we hand out surgeon's licenses by lottery, for instance, right? Like, I'm not, I think that we need to think about, one, there's a few things. One is, I think if we do something about the payouts at the top, we'll reduce a lot of the pressure that starts very early. Mm-hmm. I mean, part of what makes the meritocracy so sick and competitive is the sense that there's some really scarce set of good jobs at the end of this whole process, right? I mean, if that weren't the case, the stakes would lower at every point in it, right? You wouldn't have parents crazed to drill their 3-year-old. If there was confidence that, you know, they could go to a school and they'd go to another school and then they'd have a job and they'd be able to buy a house and they'd be happy, or they wouldn't be happy, but, you know. So I think that one of the reasons I focus on sort of redistribution is because I do think that the inequality at the top does have all these downward weight effects that bring out the worst parts of the meritocracy in terms of its in the way it works in this funneling effect. I also think that we need to think about what are institutions that are universal, that we all share in. I mean, the thing about the meritocracy is differentiation. Mm-hmm. So, you know, a great example of this is the California state college system. Mm. You know, it's a universal public good that was a place that people who didn't have a lot of money and people who did have a lot of money went to school, right? And it's been a tremendously successful engine of social mobility. And what are we seeing happen to the state college system, right? It's being eviscerated. In fact, we need more of those, right? We need more public, universally provisioned public goods where everybody is interacting in the same place. Because the really pernicious parts of the meritocracy are the way it does this constant razor-thin selection.
Which points to asking what are the kinds of institutions, the California State College system, public parks, that are still institutions but exist not to differentiate.
Right, I mean,
Libraries.
libraries which are also getting gutted left and right. Libraries are amazing. Can you imagine, I think about this all the time, could you imagine the government, some government, like if a library didn't exist, creating it now? Could you imagine like going to Congress and saying to the publishing industry, here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna build a bunch of buildings. We're gonna stock it with your product and give it away. Like it's preposterous. Like it would be the most ridiculous thing. And yet, of course, they're an amazing universal public good that they're exactly the model of the kind of thing that we have less and less of.
As I was reading the book and listening to you tonight, I want to ask you one historian's question and then hear from the audience. I thought a lot about the 60s. I thought about the best and the brightest, which in some ways your book is a reworking of. And that's a story of a crisis of authority, and yet it's one in a time of abundance rather than economic scarcity, and one that produces almost the opposite kind of culture, the counterculture. So how do you think about the similarities and differences between those two moments of the falling, the utter collapse of trust in the great men and the elites?
I think the 60s are an interesting parallel, precisely for all the reasons you note. I think it's largely an encouraging story insofar as, it did really lead to the end of the old patriarchal white northern WASP establishment, which still hangs on at the margins, but it really did create a genuine disruption and change in the way that the nation chose who to put in the positions of power. I mean, when I talk about the meritocracy and I critique it, I obviously have a certain affection for it as well, insofar as I'm a product of it. And also, under no other social model in the history of the Republic could a man named Barack Obama, from the background he came from, right, with the skin color he has, be elected president of the United States. I mean, that is the crowning achievement. In fact, I think that was why we all felt the ecstasis that we did on that warm November night. Because it was the promise made good. The promise that started back when the assaults on exactly that old order began. And so the lesson I take away is that the assaults on that order were successful in large part, which means the current order is not foreordained.
I was going to say, though, that with all the problems the best and the brightest of that period had, there was maybe less social. There was a sense of service. You wouldn't see as many Jamie Dimons wandering the landscape. There was, not to be nostalgic and not to romanticize, but there was a different meritocracy.
Yes, I mean, I think
the distance wasn't as great.
There was less social distance, just in terms of like where people lived, where elites lived. They were less clustered in specific places. There was also, John Judas has a book basically about this called The Paradox of American Democracy, which basically talks about, I mean, his thesis ends up, and John is a good liberal, left liberal, basically saying our fortunes kind of rise or fall with how good our elites are. And, we had some good ones during a period, there's some bad ones now. I don't think I'm quite that fatalistic about that being necessarily the truth.
Here's a set of questions from the audience, and one follows up on an exchange that Katrina, you and Chris had about anti-intellectualism. Isn't anti-institutionalism and insurrectionism in the right often right-wing, anti-knowledge, and dangerous? I mean, I think it's asking you to now to kind of parse the left and right flavors of what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and it can take some really. I mean, that's why I think that it is precisely that fact that is the source of my inner David Brooks. Here is Rush Limbaugh making his case for him. In 2010, Rush Limbaugh told his 15 million listeners that the list of untrusty institutions extended way past Al Gore. He described, and now I am quoting, government, academia, science, and media as making up what he called the four corners of deceit. Those institutions, he told his listeners, are now corrupt and exist by virtue of deceit. That's how they promulgate themselves. It is how they prosper. Think about what it would mean to dispatch the duties of citizenship while discounting every single piece of information that emanated from government, the academy, science, or the media. So yes, insurrectionism on the right can take some very, very ugly forms. And in some ways, part of the reason I care so much about better institutional performance is because I am scared of the way that kind of insurrectionism manifests itself in our politics.
You know, a personal follow-up, and maybe I'm channeling my own inner David Brooks here, but it seems to me you describe yourself as an insurrectionist who's worried, but actually all of your comments have been kind of trying to reclaim a kind of institutionalism for progressive politics and reclaiming science, reclaiming the capacity to build universal institutions. Why do you call yourself an insurrectionist?
Yeah, maybe I'm giving myself away here. I think that I'm affected. Why do I call myself an insurrectionist? I call myself an insurrectionist because I fundamentally think that the trust problem, which I think is a real problem, is the symptom, not the cause. And that the cause is the institutional performance, and the cause is the failure of the elites, and the cause is institutional failure, and that's what I want to address. And one of the things that makes addressing that quite so urgent is that trust relationship is an important one. But it cannot be willed back into existence. I mean, you see this actually even when if you read Barack Obama's inaugural address, which is just this incredibly institutionalist address. And I mean, this is the great contradiction of Barack Obama, is that, of course, he ran as an insurrectionist. I mean, and he has been from day one in office an institutionalist. But of course, he and the American people should work together, engaged in a process of willing us back into a healthy relationship to our institutions. But you can't will it back. Like, people have to stop being foreclosed on.
So here's actually a terrific segue to a question that builds on what you were just saying. The rise of Occupy Wall Street has led me to this question. The questioner writes, can citizens really build trust, as you talk about in your book, in a leaderless movement?
I think it is so interesting that both the Tea Party and Occupy are very intensely view themselves as being leaderless movements, and often are. I think people tend to think the Tea Party is this grassroots thing that's conjured by the Koch brothers. And it's true that resources really do matter. I'm not sure if it weren't for the amount of money that's being poured into it, we would have the same manifestation we do. But on the ground, I mean, if you get on a Tea Party listserv, those are real people who are really organizing. We saw it in the Scott Walker race in Wisconsin. They got outspent 7-1 or 12-1 or 14-1 or whatever it is, but there was a lot of doors knocked and a lot of phone calls made. And those are, actual people who are actually grassroots activists. And Jonathan Rauch had a great piece about the Tea Party that he wrote about this weird management manual that they all read, which is called The Starfish and the Spider, I think. The Starfish and the something. And it's about leaderless organizations and how a starfish, if you cut off one limb, it regrows it, but it's a spider, if you hit the body, then it dies. And it's about the virtue of being leaderless. And it's about, to invoke the left radical phrase in Occupy Wall Street, it's about horizontalism. Horizontalism is a term that you hear a lot from Occupy people, and it's about getting rid of hierarchy. It's a reaction to failed leadership by getting rid of leadership. That's what the General Assembly was. And I think there's something, I love the General Assembly because it was modeling what something more horizontal would look like. It was an attempt, it was a repudiation of a system in which the elites have failed because they're too socially distant. So it was a repudiation to say, let's model what it would look like if we just didn't have elites. If we just didn't say there's going to be some small group of decision makers and we were going to say we're all decision makers. Now, of course, that's hard to scale, quite famously. In fact, there's amazing work of sociology that I write about in the book that is incredibly influential in my way of thinking by a German social theorist named Robert Michels, who talks about the fact that there's a tendency for democratic organizations to devolve into oligarchy, no matter how strong their democratic commitments, because, you know, someone's got to like run the party press, right? And you start the division of labor, and some people start doing more than others, and pretty soon, there's only a few people that are making decisions.
Katrina.
I was going to say, part of what we're living through, I think, is this strong feeling, legitimate feeling, that government is rigged against, quote, ordinary people. So that, you've studied this, Chris, but that thousands of people have gone to this mode of collective self-reliance, reluctantly, but they don't feel that they can rely on institutions, and primarily government. But how do you, you know, this goes to your insurrectionist, institutionalist tension. Doesn't this feed into the anti-government animus that we're living with now? How do we take back, reclaim government? Or as some would argue in Occupy, we don't need government. We can build our own mode of
There are places,
order.
I think, where there's been withdrawal from current institutions that has created space for institutional innovation and experimentation that I do think is really awesome and admirable. I mean, Wikipedia is the ultimate rebuke to the crisis of authority, right? It's like, oh, well, we can't trust these institutions. Like, let's make this thing together that we trust.
You ever read the John Siegenthaler article?
Yes, yeah, no, I actually,
great-
right now there's like 9 wrong things about me on my Wikipedia page. Just like drive me a little crazy. And the funny thing about this,
John Siegenthaler was a close associate of President Kennedy, and his Wikipedia page had a line about how he had collaborated in the assassination
Yes.
of President Kennedy.
I mean, Wikipedia is amazing. I actually don't. I think it's incredible, and I think it's amazing that it works. And actually, as a study in a different kind of institutional setup, is really incredible because it went through exactly the process the General Assembly did, which is that it started out totally horizontal, and then it's become like incredibly finely grained hierarchical, which is that you earn different sort of so-and-so can delete so-and-so, who can delete so-and-so, who can delete so-and-so, based on the record that you have, because it turned out that you couldn't just have this unstructured thing, right? But it still retained the original amazing collaborative impetus. So they've actually like worked it out a little bit. They're still wrong about a few things about me, but it's really frustrating because you can't, you know, you can't edit your own Wikipedia page. That is verboten. So you just, it's there, and right-wingers send you nasty emails about some fact in your Wikipedia page that is wrong.
So a couple questions about institutions. One that picks up on the iron law of oligarchy. What part do you believe the labor movement can have in shaping the discussion of meritocracy? Should labor be the lead, or the I'm not quite reading it, or the continuity of the conversation? I take it to be a question about the different possibilities of the labor movement within the critique of institutions that you're talking about.
I think I wish I could answer the question of what is the future of the labor movement. And it's something I've thought about a lot. We've talked about it on the show. I've written about it. I feel a little bewildered about its future. I do think that liberal elites' contempt for the labor movement is partly due to the fact that the labor movement is absolutely, in its very core and essence, a rebuke to the meritocracy. And there is a deep tension there. There were 2 examples of institutional failure that I started reporting on that I did not put in the book. One was the levees and the Army Corps in New Orleans. And the other was Detroit and the Big Three. And mostly the reasons were because they seemed so distinct and grounded in specific places, and I didn't want to cut and trim and shape them into some foreordained theory I had to make them work. But I spent some time reporting in Detroit, and I went to meet a retired auto worker in Grand Rapids, and I pulled up to his house. And I remember this very clearly, looking at this house and thinking, this looks like the house of a partner in a law firm who lives in Brooklyn. And then I was like, yes, that's the whole point. That is what's so radical about the vision of the labor movement. And that's, that it is a rebuke to the meritocracy. This person, I think he did have a 4-year college degree, but had not gone through all this, checked all the boxes that in our current system would get you that house, right? So I do think that there's a deep antipathy among the upper echelons of the Democratic Party elite towards labor unions, and I think it grows out of that resentment.
Even as institutions, they often exemplify the very pathologies that you're talking about.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think you can't talk about labor and labor's demise without having a conversation about what labor has done to help that along.
So another institutional question, how do the last 2 U.S. Supreme Court appointments fit into the oligarchy of the elites?
The Supreme Court is a fascinating institution. I have a lot of affection for the Supreme Court, and that affection, my wife clerked on the court for one of the great heroes of American public life, John Paul Stevens. Yes. He is a hero. He is truly a hero. I cannot, my wife, I don't think she'd mind me saying this in public. I mean, she would take a bullet for the man. Just boundless regard for him and the way he conducts himself and his integrity. And during the year that she clerked on the court, I got to go see a lot of oral arguments. And if you haven't ever seen oral arguments in the Supreme Court, I really urge you to make a point of doing it. The next time you're in Washington, at some point, particularly if you go on a day where there's not some big, sexy case, if you want to see, some administrative issue with the railroad law resolved, go. And the thing that's amazing about the court is that it seems to me the only institution of the three in the Constitution and in our political life that even if it's maddening, doesn't seem corrupt. In the sense that it doesn't seem that the people are making decisions in bad faith because they are bought. Right. So some people don't agree with that.
Rebutting your view.
I think the court has functioned qualitatively differently just because, here's how I'd respond to that. If you're a liberal who thinks that money in politics is a huge problem, then whatever can be said at the Supreme Court, that's not the problem in the court. They have life tenure. They're not raising any money. They don't spend all day on the phone with hedge fund managers, right? So for people whose analysis of the problem that we have is the influence of big money, the rightward drift of the court poses a theoretical problem. Because if the analysis is that big money is skewing the results because big money skews the way that campaigns are run in Congress and the presidency, that doesn't have the explanatory power in terms of the court. Now, obviously, the court is appointed by the president, and the president, is subject to all the parts of that big money play. The Affordable Care Act arguments seem to me a watershed for the court, because the thing that I cherished in the oral arguments in the court when I would go is that it did seem like they were engaging in good faith, and the Affordable Care Act argument sounded like floor speeches on the House.
Yeah.
It sounded like right-wing talk radio. Literally sounded like right-wing talk radio. The broccoli example is just a crazy right-wing talk radio hypo. Mm-hmm. So I think something has happened to the court that's really, really terrifying and problematic. And I can't put my finger on what that is.
Maybe the polarization you've described. When would you see a Souter or even an Earl Warren
Or
emerge,
JPS.
or that's right.
John Paul Stevens had in his office a letter from Gerald Ford that says, "I'm willing to let the totality of my legacy rise and fall on my appointment of John Paul Stevens to the bench." And if that's true, then Gerald Ford has a very good legacy.
Elena Kagan is a graduate of Hunter High School, I think.
She is. Her brother was one of my teachers.
And here's a question about your experience at Hunter. Do you think schools like it, so-called meritocracies, are net positive or negative for students? What improvements would you make to correct the inequality that these types of schools tend to reinforce?
Whether a school like that is a net positive for the students who are admitted, to me, is not a question. It's massively net positive. It was completely life-changing. There are three things that formed me: my parents, Hunter College High School, and my wife. I mean, that, and you know.
He is an institutionalist.
And three of those things, you know, and two of those things are human beings, right? Hunter College High School totally transformed my life. It opened up a whole set of vistas. It introduced me to people that today are still people that I'm absolutely closest to in the world. I got an incredible education. I imbibed a kind of confident, cosmopolitan vision of boundless possibility there. And so in terms of its net benefit for the students who get in, there's no question. The problem is the social problem that not everyone can go. And the question is, who's going to get in? And what I write about in the book is that we've seen over time the percentage of students admitted who are African American Latino has dwindled to a terrifyingly tiny, small percentage. Now, African American and Latino students were always underrepresented in Hunter because Hunter admittance is based on one single test, and there are massive testing disparities across income level and race, and that, you know, obviously there's literature that fills libraries about that. But the problem's gotten worse. Part of the reason the problem's gotten worse is because inequality in the city has gotten worse. Part of the reason is the test prep industry has grown up around the test, in which you can pay $90 an hour to a tutor or $1,000 for a cram school. Now it's the case that students are getting in. People I talked to there were saying that the majority of students there have gone through some testing regime. So the question of what to do about it, I think there's a few ways to think about it. One is just make more of them. I mean, if there's a scarce good, just make more of them. Put one in the South Bronx. Put one in Bed-Stuy. And then just take the next group of kids that get on the test. So that's one solution. Another solution is there are ways to say, look, we're going to look at, you know, the cutoff is on this test is 120, and we're going to just go down the people who are clustered near that makeup, and we're going to choose people that, you know, are Black and Latino. Because we're a public institution in a city that's majority Black and Latino, and we're not going to run a public institution in a city that's majority Black and Latino with no Black and Latino students, because that's unacceptable.
So this seems like a good last question to ask. The writer writes, "We watch Up religiously, and in our house, you are Chris Hayes, the voice of reason. Is there any one person or source that you consider your voice of reason?" And the nation can't count for this question.
Well, that's very kind. I would say that on a personal and professional level, I cannot overstate my admiration for Rachel Maddow. She and I are close, and she is truly one of the most exceptional people I've ever met. She is the way that she appears to be. She is 1,000% authentic, has just total integrity. Works, I mean, you can't imagine how much work that show is. It's just crazy. I mean, I've sat in and hosted that show. I've done it once for a whole week. I was like, this is nuts. Like, I need to take a month off. I mean, you get up every day, and it's like, I need to come up with 6 completely novel, smart, fresh takes on what's happening today. Like, it's impossible. And she pulls it off. So, yeah, and I also think that what she has done is transformational in terms of what cable news is. I mean, people write all the time about cable news. Cable news has almost become a kind of cliche, like a placeholder to represent things you don't like about our political culture. And I understand why that's the case. I mean, I understand the critique. But I think it underestimates just how much change there's been. I mean, what Rachel has done and what Melissa is now doing and what we're trying to do on my show, I think is really is changing people's expectations of the medium. And it's an amazing medium in that way. I mean, you know, you talk to a lot of people. Like, I run into bodega owners in Brooklyn, you know, and they're watching. And that's really something else.
Well, one of the things I personally really admire about Rachel Maddow is that she's not only the voice of reason, but the voice of feeling and joy and openness. And I've now heard you speak on this podium twice, and you've conveyed exactly that same feeling. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, all of you. Thank you. Thanks, guys.